So welcome everyone. My name is Marc-Andre Pigeon, and I am the director of the Canadian Centre for Study of Co-operatives. Today's topic is social finance, and this is an issue that views closely to my personal research interests and fascinations with money, frankly. I want to do a little digression around this because I think it relates to our land acknowledgement that we like to start our events with. So my interests in money have always been a bit fraught. Because I can marvel at money's ability as a tool to coordinate behavior and translate ambitions about the future into the present. But I also recognize that there's a long and deep thread of research that shows how the concept of money, the application of money, has been used as a tool of colonialism. So, for example, when European colonial powers came into Africa, and again, there's a lot of research to kind of make this case, they confronted populations that were often, in many cases, self-sustaining. And one of the ways they would kind of compel labor market participation was to impose tax liabilities, and only payable in the form of money, of the colonial powers' money. So this was a way of coercing local populations into the labor market. We don't have to go far to see echoes of that kind of propensity to use money as a tool of coercion, of marketization, with the widespread use of script in Western Canada to dispossess Métis people. And so before we begin today's conversation, I want us to reflect on that truth and acknowledge that we're coming to you from lands that where these practices would have been part of the norm. So Treaty 6 territory in the case of Saskatoon, this is the land of the Cree, the Saulteaux, the Dene, the Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota, as well as the traditional homeland of the Métis. And we are grateful today for the opportunity to work and share in this land and its bounty, to reflect on its beauty, and to reaffirm our commitment to the hard shared work of reconciliation. So it's my great, with that kind of those introductory remarks, it's my great pleasure to introduce you to our speaker today, Sean Geobey. Sean is the director of the Waterloo Institute for Complexity and Innovation. I'm not sure how to say the acronym, Sean, so I'm just going to skip it. He is an associate professor in social innovation and social entrepreneurship in the School of Environment, Enterprise, and Development. That one I can say, SEED, and co-director of the Waterloo Institute for Social Innovation and Resilience, WISR, at the University of Waterloo. Not bad, you'll correct me later. He currently leads a research team working in partnership with the Canadian Community Economic Development Network, CEDNET, to support the Canadian Social Finance Fund's Investment Readiness Program. And as Sean was telling us just before we came on, everyone joined us, he's actually in Ottawa to talk about these, or engaged in these kind of questions. So his work involves a systematic mapping and principles-focused evaluation of the Canadian social finance sector, and we're going to hear about that today. Now, before we hear from Sean, a word on our co-op conversation series. So over the next 15 or 20 minutes, Sean's going to share some of his thoughts on the work that he and the center have led. Then we'll have a short conversation, Sean and I, followed by a breakout into group discussions around a question that Sean has set up for us. And that breakout will last about 15 minutes. Now, we always lose a few people when we do these breakouts, but I want you to kind of consider sticking around. One thing we hear repeatedly in the evaluations is just how much people value these informal opportunities in network. They're a way for you to meet new people, maybe feel a bit awkward with those newfound acquaintances, but that can be generative, right? And if you happen to be with people who you already know, you can revel in the retrouvailles and the reacquaintances that are going to present themselves. So if anyone, so that's just a little more word of encouragement to stick around for the breakout. And if anyone is experiencing technical difficulties along the way, you can message Stan Yu. And Stan, would you please wave to folks? Oh, there he is.
Hi, everyone.
Go, Stan. And then lastly, I'll just say that we're going to be recording this session, and the link will be shared with everyone who's registered for the event. And we'll be emailing that out to you very shortly. Sean, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marc-Andre. So I am, as noted, in Ottawa right now. So that is the unceded Anishinaabe territory, though usually I work on the Haldimand Tract, which is part of land promised to the Six Nations after the American Revolution, on territory that is traditionally Anishinaabe, neutral, and Haudenosaunee. So Just to let you know a bit where I am coming from, both now and generally, because it is the Haldeman Tract, otherwise known as Kitchener-Waterloo, is part of that, where I mostly do my work. And I'm going to start us off with just a bit of a personal tale that I think is worth talking about. So back in 2020, I think all of us became very familiar with this little guy here, the COVID-19 virus, which shut down almost everything for us. So in the midst of this global health pandemic, as a family, my partner was pregnant with our second child, and we also had a 3-year-old at home. So midway through our second trimester. And as part of that, we because we have a bit of a strained, if not collapsed, childcare system here in Ontario, we did the most rational thing we could think of to have childcare, since we don't have any family in town, which is my partner's mom offered to help us with childcare. She happens to live on Vancouver Island, which a map of Canada will tell you is quite a bit far from Kitchener-Waterloo. So it wasn't a day drop-off thing. So we drove across the country and spent 8 months where I was working remotely after my second son was born. And on our way back, so we drove back home in May of 2021. We passed through, because we drove there and back, we passed through Kamloops, British Columbia, where not even a week earlier, they started exhuming the bodies of what would eventually be over 215 Aboriginal children who were found on the site of the Kamloops Residential School. About a week after we left, the largest wildfires in Canadian history had gone through British Columbia and destroyed one of the towns that we actually went and stopped for a lunch break. So one of the places where we stopped for lunch, a week after we went through, became a refugee center for internally displaced people in the interior of BC. And I bring this up because when we're dealing with really complex challenges in our world, they're often very interconnected. I mean, these are fraying social systems under economic strain, through these health issues and environmental catastrophe. And there's a lot of framings people have used around this. One is this idea of a global polycrisis. And this is what we're trying to deal with as individuals, as societies, as all of humanity, is this very complex interconnected web of challenges that we're facing. So social finance, co-ops, where does all this fit in? Well, we have only so many institutions formally that we have for trying to respond to these polycrises. Now, some of them are informal. We have families, we have social networks, we have knowledge systems, we have secular and religious and academic texts that we refer to, all of that. But when it comes to organizations, well, we have a pretty limited array. Big one is markets. Let the private sector do it. Fortunately, one of the things that we know is that markets have failures, imperfect information, monopoly power, public goods and externalities. So we can't lean on them entirely. But then we have another solution set, which is, of course, government, the public sector. However, the government itself has failures, imperfect information, but in a different way. We're not talking about buyers and sellers not knowing the quality of goods or being incentivized to lie to each other. We're dealing with just the government being too big and slow to be able to know what actually the needs of its populations are. We have self-interest. We have short-termism. It's very hard to have policies that last the life of a government. So who else? Well, often we have a social sector and social purpose organizations that are there to pick up the slack. However, and this is certainly of the three of these large sectors, the one that's most underexplored, they are not without their failures as well. And so a writer, Lester Salomon, in the 80s identified four failures that are particular to that sector. One is paternalism. Those who donate the money have different interests than those who are supposed to benefit from it. Second is particularism. organizations in the sector tending to see their work as competing for the same resources and fracturing into ever smaller and smaller organizations with often similar mandates. Third is insufficiency. So the scope of the problem being too big for the resources available. And a fourth is amateurism, often a result of insufficiency. You have high turnover, you have unstable funding, you have unstable leadership. And as a consequence, it's very hard to get the level of depth, expertise, knowledge in the work to actually be effective, even with the limited resources that you have. So where does social finance fit in? Well, the definition of social finance that comes from the Canadian Task Force is the active investment of capital in businesses and funds that generate positive social and environmental impacts as well as financial returns to an investor. The way this often is construed or thought of is as really being the funding of that third sector, that social purpose sector. And so conceptually, those social purpose organizations, that's a federal government term that really has no meaning outside Canada, but it's the one that we use. We're trying to address particularism by paternalism, insufficiency, and amateurism by growing the size of the sector so there's less competition over scarce resources, improved accountability to stakeholders, actually having real investment in machinery and equipment, actual capital investment, and competitive wages so that we actually have some stickiness of the workforce in the sector. Okay, that's our starting point. And I'll give you a bit of the background for how we at Wiser have been working within this program. So the Canadian Social Finance Fund was meant to try and address this by investing in the sector. $755 million. The funding has really just started this year that investments have been made, even though this project was originally announced 6 or 7 years ago. 7 years ago, I think, 2016. But there was an awareness that there was a need to prepare social purpose organizations to be investment ready. So there was a round of funding, $50 million in grants starting in 2019 to 21. Our work was funded for that. We ran a project called the Legacy Leadership Lab. And there's a link to it there. Look it up. Very interesting. We were looking at essentially the creation of social purpose organizations by converting conventional enterprises into social purpose organizations. So a lot of you might be familiar with the Co-op Convert project and other longer standing issues of trying to do cooperative conversions, very much in the same wheelhouse. Now, after our project was done, after that first round was done, a second round of investment readiness program funding was released. Another $50 million over another 2 years. We're wrapping up this spring. And Wiser was brought back basically to do a system mapping and evaluation, principles-focused evaluation of the program. So we kind of went from being a partner funded under the program to now being a partner who was evaluating the program as a whole. And really a question that I have in the background all the time is like, is it possible to actually have a social finance ecosystem that is robust and self-sustaining? And what would it look like? So we're all interested in the co-op movement. Have co-ops been involved? Have they been funded? Well, yes. So 33 co-ops have been funded under the Investment Readiness Program. But it's worth noting that outside the Investment Readiness Program, there are at least 15 different pockets of money that have been funding co-op development that you could think of as being investment readiness. That said, through our engagement with the program and others, one of the things we have ensured is that under the Investment Readiness Program, as it rolls out or as it continues, maybe rolling out, we don't know if it's going to get renewed, but they were at least able to ensure that co-op conversions are part of the mandate of what the Canadian social finance looks like. And I'm going to have to give a special shout out here to our colleagues at Co-ops and Mutuals Canada for tracking these things and providing the information. So I've links to some of their reports there. Now, what does this look like in the scope of the entire investment readiness program? Well, of the total of all the applications and pieces that were funded under the investment readiness program, over 91% and almost 90% that either applied or funded were nonprofits, charities, or for-profit social enterprises. Where do co-ops fit in? Well, they're not that part. I don't have the exact numbers, but because I only got this data yesterday, but it sounds like it was in the range of about 5% of the funded projects or cooperatives, which, given the size of the sector, the scale and the diversity of it, strikes me as being a relatively small. What else do we know about the social purpose organizations that were funded? Well, they tended to be new. So over 70% of the grants were awarded to enterprises that were created within the last, over a third went to organizations that were created within the last 5 years. And in the for-profit social enterprise space, it was the vast majority. It was almost 3/4. So we don't know exactly where the co-ops would fit within this, but it does seem that there is very much a skew towards newer organizations that have been funded under the IRP. So thinking about what that means, for the overall program, is it a concern that other types of organizations, so co-ops fits in that other organization umbrella, but also so do more informal economy organizations as well, often that have kind of cooperative values, but aren't necessarily formally structured as co-ops. And also the question of whether there's familiarity with the types of social finance concepts and funding opportunities that are out there. And a special thanks on this to the folks at the Investment Readiness Program, which is, the site is largely put together and run by SEDNet, but the data analysis actually comes from a firm called Aja, and Ben McNamee and Richard Bartle-Tubbs are the folks there who've been doing a lot of the data work there. So taking a big step back, where do the co-ops fit? Historically, when we look at where the social finance ecosystem is in Canada, a lot of the places where we have a robust social finance ecosystem, we first had a robust cooperative ecosystem. And as the lovely Danielle Brunette at Co-ops and Mutuals Canada likes to say at all of our meetings, co-ops were the first social enterprises in Canada, and I absolutely agree with it. So the history, what we learn about social enterprise more broadly, very much leans on a lot of the lessons that come out of the cooperative movement. The Canadian Social Finance Fund itself, I think implicitly as its starting point, really was looking at startup for-profit social enterprises and spin-offs from existing charities and nonprofits. I don't think it would be a stretch to say co-ops weren't really deeply in the initial conceptualization. Instead, it was much more about bringing philanthropic dollars and capital-based finance to the table. And so, especially in the first round of the Investment Readiness Program, cooperative representation was very light. It's grown a lot in the second round, but still, given the relative strength and depth of the sector, I would say it's still fairly light. However, one of the things I've observed sort of informally through being involved in this program since the beginning is that over time, those who don't come out from the co-op sector seem to be discovering or rediscovering a lot of those original 7 co-op principles and keep sort of on their own coming up with, wow, it would be really good if we did this or this or this. And in the back of my head, it's always like, you mean principle 3 or principle 6 or principle 7? Like there's a lot of, there's something timeless about the co-op principles that keeps coming up. And I think this brings me to the big question of why. And I would posit that first, there is an implicit theory that underpins the social finance fund and the approach that's been taken in Canada so far to the social finance sector, which is that we're really trying to blend, we're really trying to think about how to blend capital markets and philanthropy. Can we find a blend between the two? But I'm going to posit there's a second rival way of looking at this, which is that really we can think of those two inherently as being a bit tied together as philanthropic capital. But then ask, okay, where does mutual aid fit in? And this is a long-standing tension. This is a tension that goes back to at least the 19th century between mutual aid and philanthropy. Are we doing well by doing good, which is, I think, that philanthropy and capital market blend kind of mindset? Or are we helping us help ourselves, which is much more that mutual aid mindset? And where does that model of philanthropic failure fit in with the co-op movement? Like, do co-op modes of organizing actually inherently have a lot of robustness and resilience because they have another way of dealing with some of those issues? And I'm pausing a couple of key connections to principles here. Particularism is the antithesis of cooperation amongst co-ops. Paternalism is the antithesis of democratic member control. Insufficiency, well, member economic participation is meant in some ways to address that. And amateurism, the education, the training, and the information are all about, and also, I guess, member economic participation as well, are all about trying to address some of those amateurism issues. So this then leads me to some remaining questions. Are there still tensions within cooperative social finance? So I talked about the philanthropic sector failure, but there's I don't know if there's a full theory of cooperative failure yet, but I'll posit a couple of things that keep coming up from both my experience and my work. One is, the barriers to entry and tensions between those who are inside a co-op and outside a co-op. I'd suggest Hirschman's classic work, Exit Voice Loyalty, is really an interesting lens on this. I would also say that there's the costs and benefits of democratic decision-making versus the perceived benefits of hierarchical decision-making. Or alternative to hierarchical decision-making, you can also think, the market price mechanism as well. And so here we'd think about folks like Henry Hansman and probably Oliver Williamson as well. Community economic development is implied in a cooperative model, but it comes at the expense of not necessarily being able to access global capital markets, or at least not accessing them with the same tools that financial capital uses right now for investor-owned capital-based firms. So those are some open questions, which are really more discussion points than anything else. But I wanted to turn this over a question for you who are all on the call with us today, which is, how can the cooperative sector be better prepared to access social finance? And I think an important piece tied to that, does it even want to? Wonderful. And that's my slides. So I'll put it back to Marc-Andre.
Thank you so much, Sean. Stan is going to post your question in the chat so that it's kind of universally available. If you can take down your screen now, please, Sean.
Sure.
And we're going to just have a very brief conversation, then we're going to do the breakout. So Sean, I love this presentation. I've learned so much just in this little 15, 20 minutes. I do have a couple of questions, one very factual. Can you tell me about the investment readiness program? That is really about getting to the point where you can apply later on for the larger social finance money. Is that right?
Yes.
What's the distinction there, I guess?
But so I would say the yes, but here. So that was the original purpose of the investment readiness program when it was launched in 2019. However, I would say one of the things that's really interesting that's come out of it is that, the investment readiness program, the first round was 2019 to 2021. The second round was 2021 to 2023. Both rounds basically went to completion without the social finance fund actually having the proper infrastructure ready to be able to invest. So I know it sounds a bit backwards. In part, I think because ESDC, or certainly these parts of ESDC, had never done repayable capital as part of their internal government structure. So it's taken them much longer than I think they anticipated to figure that out. So while conceptually, it's been to get social purpose organizations in the place where they'd be ready to take on investment. In reality, I think it's been a mixture of that has been a big part of what's come out of it. But then there's also a lot of it, which has been about trying to build the intermediary structure in the social finance ecosystem. So if we think of there being buyers and sellers, there's also all this stuff in the middle of how do you do the matchmaking, how do you do the training and development of the organizations to be investment ready. So, more of the permanent infrastructure around that. And those, I think, have all kind of been financed under the investment readiness program. And I would also say one of the pieces that really didn't happen under the investment readiness program, because the actual social finance fund and the selection of the so basically the fund itself doesn't get directly distributed by the federal government. They've actually found 3 wholesalers to do the distribution. Because the wholesalers weren't named until this year, they weren't at the table as part of the investment readiness program. And my hunch is that to actually make this whole thing viable long term, what they actually need is the investment readiness program to not just have essentially the side that is going to be absorbing the financing at the table, but also those providing it too. Because if you're just approaching social purpose organizations the same way you would any other standard private investment, you're probably going to screw it up. You actually need to, it can't just be a one-sided adaptation here.
So there's learning that needs to happen on the supplier side that we
I think so.
don't know much about yet, right?
Yeah, and they're so new to the table that it's very hard. I mean, luckily they are all wholesalers who have experience working in these and related places, including some with a lot of work with the co-op sector.
Okay.
Like one of the wholesalers is Realized Capital, which is a new creation, which had new market funds, which has been very heavily involved in a lot of financing in the co-op sector, is essentially the key partner there. Yeah.
Okay. So that John, sorry, Sean, this is really helpful. I was thinking of John, the new Realize strategy. But the just one follow-up question, then we're going to jump into the breakout. So you've kind of documented, let's say, tepid take up so far from the co-ops on the investment readiness side. What would be some of the reasons you might expect that to be the case? I think you've alluded to maybe a lack of understanding on the other side, but why the co-ops themselves have not put their names forward? And I can think of many reasons, but what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, I'll posit some of my thoughts, and then I'd be happy for you to jump in as well to add to it. But a couple that would jump out at me is, one is that although it could use more oomph, there is still, relatively speaking, a much more robust cooperative financing sector already in existence than there has been of, essentially charity finance. Because that's been entirely grants, for all of history since the sector started in Canada, whereas the co-op sector has had a more diverse way of approaching finance. So some of it might just simply be relative lack of demand, because there are actually already avenues for co-ops to receive financing. I'd say second is that because the program has largely been built on the back of a lot of the philanthropic sector, and that's been where a lot of the training, the programming, the dissemination of the program and informing people about it. Historically, there's also not been particularly strong links between the charitable sector and the cooperative sector either. And so even in terms of the outreach, you're really talking about a couple of channels that don't usually interact with the co-op sector that are supposed to be really the backbone of the program. So those would be the ones that would really jump out at me as being fairly obvious. Yeah.
Right. So I think your question is kind of taking us in this direction. So maybe I'll refrain from adding much. We can talk about it when we resume the plenary session. So let's go to the breakout. What are our numbers at, Stan, in terms of attendance here? I see 19. Let's do 6 groups of 3, or 1 group of 4. The other rest are 3. And then Stan will break for about 12 minutes, 10, 12 minutes. Make sure we're back by 12:45. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for Stan for juggling the groups. I think we lost a few people when we did the breakout, so appreciate that, Stan. It made for a more interesting conversation. We were getting going. So we have a full crew back, and now's our chance to ask Sean questions in general. I want to throw the microphone open, if I can put it that way, for people to pose their questions. If you want to raise your hand or maybe write something in chat. Yusuf, there you go. Go ahead, Yusuf. I know you're itching, so go ahead. And you're muted, Yusuf. You're going to have to unmute yourself.
I'll just ask one question, and then if I can, later on, I'll ask another question. But is there going to be like investment readiness program 3.0, or like what's the future hold with regards to that?
That is a good question, Yusuf. I suggest that that is a question that you should direct towards your local member of parliament. Because we don't actually have we actually don't have an answer whether there's going to be a 3.0. I think there would be a lot of value in a 3.0, but ultimately that is a political decision that has yet to be decided.
Sean, can I ask a follow-up question? So you mentioned that the fund itself is just, they've identified the wholesalers. When is that money going to start rolling out? Do you know?
So that is a good question, because I think in theory, I believe the money is supposed to start flowing right now. I don't know whether any the ink is dried on any investments. But from my understanding, it was sometime late in the summer it was early in the summer that the announcement happened, which was, where were we at? Yeah, June. June was when the formal announcement was there. So in theory, they've been authorized to do investments since then. I don't know how many they've actually solidified, though. I don't know if they had any. I had assumed they had some in the can that would have kind of gone through on day one, but I don't know if there have been, because I haven't seen any big announcements.
Okay, all right, thanks, Sean.
Just out of curiosity, like when I've been checking, I can't apply for anything, right? It's done. Currently,
yes, the investment readiness program is now currently done. It's frozen. I guess you could go to one of the wholesalers and apply directly to them. I mean, they're a fund investor, so it's probably going to be more reference, but I mean, you can certainly reach out to them.
Okay. Sean, I see we have a question from Vern. Go ahead, Vern.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. The wholesalers, and you did mention Realized Capital was one of them, which is sort of the old new market fund sort of group. So they have some experience in this for sure, and have the capability and qualifications. Do the other wholesalers, do you know if they have or are being helped by lenders or people with experience in lending at all? And how those principles will be adjusted because of the need for typically patient capital in these kinds of investments?
Yeah, so it's a good question. It is generally patient capital that they're kind of attracting with this. So the way that the funds are, at least we're supposed to be deployed, is it's $755 million, and I believe at this point only $400 million have been allocated to the wholesalers. So there is still some held back for potentially even a new group of wholesalers to come in to do that piece. But the capital wasn't supposed to be deployed unless there was at least a one-to-one match from another co-investor as well. So there is this idea that it's not just that fund from the federal government; it's supposed to also be money that comes in from other foundations or the private sector or the cooperative sector, who would then be matching that. Potentially with the government, with the deals being structured where maybe the government is a first loss lender, or it's a different subordinate position. The funds who are involved all do have some experience. I would say from what I saw, they mostly come out of doing some essentially social purpose private equity investment. The big gap in there is, and I've been desperately trying to look up the name for these things, and I'm shocked at how hard it is to actually nail down the exact names from all of the programs. But there we go. Okay. One of the funds, which is Fonds de Finance Sociale, CAP Finance, is based in Quebec. So they essentially work in the Quebec ecosystem, which looks very, very different from the rest of Canada. But then the two that are out there, the other ones are really have experience, again, either in the private equity side or in so Boan Social Impact, is one, and the other is Realize Capital Partners, and they all have some background working with more patient capital models. Yeah.
Thank you. That's helpful. I assume they must. Yeah. Okay.
Thanks for
Would that be shared in the chat?
those three names. Is that what you're asking? Sorry.
And then and then
Thank
someone
you.
also mentioned the wholesalers.
Yeah. So I'm gonna just put in the chat the names of those wholesalers so you can look them up.
While you're doing that, Sean, I'll throw another question at you. What's the expected what kind of returns are they looking for? They imagine these are self-sustaining funds, right? That would exist over long time periods, I imagine. Is that the idea?
I think that's what they're anticipating. I mean, they're originally, the mandates. I don't know if they're still sticking to the original mandate, which was the deployment of all the money over 10 years, but because it's all repayable, it's all debt or equity. The idea is it would feed back into essentially these evergreen funds.
Right.
The original goal was the deployment of all $755 million plus the matching, which would basically mean you're looking at between $1.5 and $3 billion worth of capital going out over a period of 10 years. But that was 7 years ago. So I don't think that's all going to be deployed in the next 3 years. I imagine we're really looking at realistically, maybe they're going to try and deploy it all by 2035. But yeah, the idea is that these will be evergreen funds later on, is the hope. I think that's part of the reason it took so long to get them deployed, is that the federal government just in this space has never really had an evergreen fund.
I have a question I'm hesitant to ask, but I think I'll ask it anyway, Sean. It's like, do you think this fund and the commitment would survive a political cycle, a new government, in 2025 or sooner?
Who knows? I mean, I think that's part of the reason that the Sustainable Finance Forum is happening right now in Ottawa, because it's being structured as a multi-partisan event.
Right.
So I think they're trying to build support for it across the political spectrum. There are some reasons to think that it could potentially be something that would see support from across the political spectrum. The big push in the United Kingdom to do more of the social financing over there actually came under a conservative government. Their project was called Big Society Capital. And so there's a certain rhetoric around using the social finance space as a way of offloading the duties of government. But this iteration of the Conservative Party, I don't know if that's particularly been at the forefront of a lot of their language and approach. So who knows?
Right. Yeah, sorry, that's a tough question. I can't help but think it, right? Because we're just on the
I can't help but think it either.
Okay, Sean, one last question for me, unless somebody else wants to throw one on the table before we wrap up. Sean, you mentioned these co-ops that have been through the investment readiness program. Do we know anything about them? What might characterize them or not? Yeah,
I don't know if there's much I would say that jumps out as being in common between them all. But here, I'm gonna
sure.
And the nice thing is, so this was actually pulled together not by the investment readiness program, was actually pulled together by Co-ops and Mutuals Canada. Yeah. So so it was Danielle Brunette there who
gotcha.
Helped me identify this list. And they really came from all across Canada. So the investment readiness program wasn't directly the federal government doing the funding. They went through a number of other organizations, mostly foundations, the Community Foundations of Canada being the big one. So a lot of them came through Community Foundations of Canada, but some came through the Foundation for Black Communities, the Chantier de l'Économie Sociale. I'm just looking to see if, and a couple from the Canadian Women's Foundation too.
Right.
So, all of the four big funders from the investment readiness program provided funding to co-ops. But, when I even look at the projects and the applications, they weren't even necessarily putting their cooperative side front and center in that either.
Yeah. I can't help but notice, Sean, I just did a very quick search. There's nothing in Saskatchewan. Oh no. Yet more federal provincial wrangling opportunities here.
I think
Okay,
so,
so,
yeah.
so
I
something
will
to
say
put
one
to
of the things that
attention
has
of
actually,
elected leaders. Yes.
yeah,
go ahead.
there's actually one thing from the data that's not a co-op thing, but it's an overall, is that the prairies seem to be a bit underrepresented in the
Uh-huh. Yeah.
IRP.
That's a bit unnerving. Okay, so Sean, this was so interesting. I thank you so much for spending some time with us and sharing your thoughts in this program. I want to stay on top of this and be in touch with you. I think this is important stuff to be aware of and you know, make known. Sean, so thank you so much again, Sean, for being here today and sharing with us. Just as
Thank
we
you for the
noted early
invite.
on, this is going to be recorded, or it has been recorded. It's going to be posted. Sean, I imagine you would be welcoming of people reaching out if they have questions.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Feel free to reach out to me. I'm putting my email address in the chat box. If you all want to reach out. But it's sgoby@waterloo.ca. Goby is spelt in a very strange way that doesn't sound like what it sounds, so you're better to read it than to try and sound it out.
For sure. Thank you, Sean. So just before we leave everyone, I want to let you know that we have our next co-op conversations taking place Wednesday, December 6th. Our speakers will be Dr. Daphne Rickson and Fiona Dogood from St. Mary's University. They're going to share some results from their research or their efforts to develop specific indicators for cooperatives to measure their performance based on the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. We'll be making that registration live very shortly. You might also be interested in our upcoming Freudian lecture. This is going to be featuring the most recent recipient of that Freudian scholarship, Sarah Furby, who I understand works for either the CRS or the Federated Cooperatives, one of the two. She's a recent graduate of the Graduate Certificate in Social Economy, Cooperatives and Nonprofit Sector program at the Johnson Shoyama Graduate School. She also has a Master's of Public Administration from the Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy. And her presentation is entitled Community-Centered Funerary Care, the Growing Presence and Impact of Funeral Cooperatives in Canada. We're going to be putting that registration link in the chat there. Stan just posted it. I think this is going to be a super interesting talk. That cooperative funeral sector has disrupted the market in Quebec in a very positive and substantial way. So let's see if that can be spread. Finally, we're excited to announce that our annual McPherson talk is going to take place on December 4th. Well, that's our tentative date. Let's put a pin on that. We might have to change it, but so far that's the way it looks. 4:30 to 5:30. And this talk honors the late, great Dr. Ian McPherson, who really kind of personified that bridge between scholarship and practitioners. And that's something we take very seriously at the center. We're going to have Dr. Morris Altman, formerly from the University of Saskatchewan, now the Dean of the University of Dundee's School of Business and Chair of Professor of Behavioral Institutional Economics and Cooperatives. For close to 20 years, Dr. Altman was head of the Department of Economics here at the University of Saskatchewan. He's also a research fellow with our center, and this is going to be a hybrid event. Morris always has interesting talks, so I'd encourage you to attend in person if you can't, or to register for the online version. So thank you all again for taking time to attend today's co-op conversation. Thank you again, Sean, for a really compelling talk. We hope you have a really great rest of your day. Take care, everyone.